Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 373. Passover is not over. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we want to start by wishing you a happy Passover, or to call back to, I think, our conversation last year, a happy Feast of the Unleavened Bread, Chag HaMatzot, because actually Passover in the Torah, and we'll talk about the Torah in our conversation today, but Passover in the Torah may only be the first day or even maybe only the first night of this holiday, and the rest of the holiday is actually started as a different holiday that got mushed together, and it was called the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So, happy Feast of the Unleavened Bread, everybody.
Call it Feast of Matzah. That's too long.
All right, Feast of Matzah. Well, we hope you had a good Passover Seders the last few days. We are going to be talking about all of that good stuff. Before we do, just a reminder that we have a growing bunch of classes that are going to be happening over the 6 weeks after Passover and before Shavuot. Register now so that you can set your calendar. There are going to be classes right after Passover ends, or I should say the Feast of the Matzah ends. Then there are going to be another bunch of classes starting 3 weeks later. So check them all out at judaismunbound.com/classes. And while you're there, you can also check out our newest An Yeshiva element, which is a certificate program where you can actually be certified in Unbound Judaism. And so check that out at judaismunbound.com/certificate. And if you indicate interest in that, you basically fill out a very brief form, and then you'll get an application packet. We think a lot of you, long-time listeners, short-time listeners, are going to be interested in this. So check it out at judaismunbound.com/certificate. Okay, Lex, so let's talk about the Passover Seders, even though they just happened. But actually, I think it's the best time to think about it, because when the Passover Seders that you just experienced are fresh in your mind, usually we're doing a show like this. Often we're doing it just a few days before the Seders, and I'm always feeling like, I wish we had done that show 2 weeks ago, because we haven't really given people enough time to think about their Seders. But now, actually, we're giving you the maximum amount of time because you have an entire year, at least on the Jewish calendar, between now and next year's Passover Seders. But the good thing is it's fresh in your mind, and maybe that's the best time to take some notes and to think about how to make it more meaningful next year. So I'm really excited that we can jump into this conversation about the Seders right after the Seders happened. I guess, Lex, I wanted to start by asking you what some of your reflections are, because I think that you are still, I shouldn't be too ageist about this, but I feel like you're still in a phase of life where your family Seders are just getting started, whereas I feel like I may be in a phase of life where my family Seders are just winding down. Not that we won't have Seders anymore, but my kids are off to college, etc. So how are you thinking about this?
A cool thing about my Seder, and I think about many Seders, is that it's never really been the Rofus when I was growing up, or the Rofberg family Seder. I mean, me, my mom, her partner are, of course, always there. My wife is there. But we tend to have like 20 people, and the vast majority of them are not related to me at all. There's no uncles, aunts, whatever. Part of that's just geographically, my family's always been very dispersed and in different places. But the other part is that growing up, my mom really lived up every year to that statement you say at the beginning of the Seder of like, all who are hungry, come and eat. There were not a lot of boundaries about who was a close enough friend or family member for who would come. Almost every year, there are people I'm meeting for the first time at our Seder that my mom hosts, because she worked at S.C. Johnson for years, a very large company, and there'd always be somebody new to the company who's Jewish, and the whole rest of the company knew to point them to my mom. And we became the place that would like receive those folks their first couple years in town when they might not have a Seder to go to yet. And often then they wouldn't come back. They'd find their people, they'd have their own family, whatever it was going to look like. But so I actually love that. And I think that part of the magic of Passover is that that a lot of people blend family-focused Seders, friend-focused Seders. There might be, community-focused Seders with a synagogue or with whatever Jewish institution. Anyway, that's one piece. The more important question that you or the equally important question that you asked is my reflections on the content or how it flowed. And for me, what I've been thinking about the last few years is, from what I want to do at a Seder, it is tough to be a rabbi in the room. Like, even though I am younger than most of our Seder guests, there is a sense that, like, okay, Lex knows a lot of stuff about the Exodus and about the history of the Haggadah or whatever, the guidebook that is used for the Seder. And so there's people who ask questions, and that's great. What my dream Seder would look like is really more horizontal, is really everybody collaborating together. Our Seder was awesome. It always is. I think that we have the greatest Seder in the universe. And it is my mom and I who mostly formulate it, who come up with what pieces we're going to do, what pieces we do every year, what pieces we switch up. It is interactive. We have scratch off tickets on the table that I think I've talked about on the podcast before, where people are encouraged to ask questions about what's going on at the Seder, because they'll receive a $1 scratch off ticket every question they ask. So we have like 50 of them scattered around.
By the way, has anyone ever won a lot of money?
We've had people win like 10 or 20 bucks. I'd never more than that. That'd be awesome. I'm sure if we did that, we would like channel it towards some liberation-based nonprofit. But like we definitely don't have a dynamic where like only a couple people are reading. We go around, different people read, different people ask questions. But I guess my dream is where it's like a potluck. And at a potluck, the expectation is, sure, the host might make a couple dishes, but they're not making enough food for everybody that's coming. They're just making a few things, and then everybody else fills in the gaps. And you know, there's a known thing that, like, when I host a potluck, I tend to get notes, a week before, like, what do you still need? What's missing? And you say, oh, we're light on desserts, or we're light on side dishes. From my perspective, Passover should be like that. Oh, what are you missing? Oh, you don't have somebody leading yachatz where you break the middle matzah. Nobody's like thinking creatively about what we do with that. Great, I'll take that part. And then you generate so if the host fills in the gaps, like maybe you don't fill every one of the 14 or 15 parts of the Seder, but so you fill 11 of them and the host fills the last 3 in the same way that they would make one extra entree or whatever for the potluck. That to me is what this should look like. And I'm not restricting that to Jews. I'm not restricting that to people who know everything. From my perspective, anybody has the tools to say, okay, karpas, I've been assigned karpas. That's this thing where you dip parsley or whatever vegetable into salt water. The ability to Google and see what are some interesting things people do with that. Do they have cool readings that tie that to something else? That's not a high level Jewish skill, but for some reason, the level in people's minds of what it takes to, like, quote, be a Seder leader is really high. And luckily, it's lower than other things. Way more people lead Seders than lead Rosh Hashanah services. Passover's in a good place compared to a lot of other holidays. But I do think that there is room for it to become more horizontal, like to have leadership more spread out. And I think that if everybody at a Seder was themselves prepping, not just the food, but like some aspect of what the collective, offering is, that would enhance what everybody's experience was. And it would create a dynamic where everybody else at those different moments is like ready to be supportive of whoever brought their ideas. I think it'd be really cool. When I've been to like services where I've been to Shabbat services where there are a bunch of people who lead and pass off different parts. And it's always really great. And it doesn't even matter if everybody has the most creative thing. Some people would just bring something traditional, and that's fine. But I think we have room to grow there, because still a lot of Seders end up burning out 1 or 2 people who like kill themselves last minute, choosing a Haggadah, organizing whatever order, all that stuff.
Yeah, I love the idea of the Seder as a potluck, meaning, just to be clear about it, meaning that the Seder ritual part is the potluck. The food part could also be the potluck, but that, what you're talking about is that the actual conducting of the Seder is like a potluck. I love that image and the idea that if we really internalize that, most people would know that if you are invited to a Seder, that means you have to bring something. I think we've talked about it in the past on the show. I kind of blame the Maxwell House Haggadah, but there's some reason why people internalized the idea that there is a right way, a liturgy, that every word must be spoken version of the Passover Seder. And even though they don't really believe that, meaning they themselves don't necessarily believe that something bad is going to happen if they don't say every word, but they assume that somebody at the table thinks that, and therefore they can't have a lot of room for riffing, and if you want to do something new, you at least have to do it in addition to the old stuff, and that makes it extremely long. And that's kind of an old story of Jewish practice. That's why our services get longer and longer and longer. By the way, this is making me think about the new rules in baseball. There's a new set of rules in baseball which are made in order to stop the game from becoming longer and longer and longer. And it's making me think about whether the same impulses are partly what caused the baseball game to get longer and longer and longer, that are the same impulses that have driven the services or the seders to get longer and longer and longer. And then to think a little bit about how baseball, by the way, apparently led by a Jew, Theo Epstein, who was I think the main consultant for these new rules, trying to shorten the game. And the way that they're doing it is not necessarily to change the substantive rules all that much, a little bit, because they've made the bases bigger, for example, to encourage more base stealing. But they've also just installed a shot clock to say that the pitcher's got to just get from one pitch to the other faster. As I think about that, it's like, actually, I kind of don't like that as transposed into the Jewish context, because that just means that people do that, blah, 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 reading. They just read faster, and that kind of takes away more and more meaning. So maybe we don't want to exactly go the way of baseball, but it's interesting to think about baseball struggling with a similar dynamic. In any event, I have a hypothesis that to the extent that people could really internalize that in the authoritative texts, I put that in quotation marks, but the texts that people think of as authoritative, or let's say the practice from 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, if they discovered that those practices were actually extremely minimal, and that the maximal practices that we have inherited were of much more recent vintage, like in the last 100 years, 200 years, that they would actually feel more emboldened, or they would feel that they're participating in something more authentic if we said it was going back to the original version, that it was shorter, that it was less specified. One of the things that has struck me recently was doing some work with B'nai Lappi on reading some of the early Talmudic texts about conversion and realizing how absolutely easy it was in the early days, and how there was almost nothing to it that was required, very little. And the same could be said about the Passover Seder in the early days, that if you look at the Mishnah, it's so little that you feel like people could fulfill the requirements easily in 10 minutes of the Passover Seder. Mm-hmm. And the rest of it would be just kind of extra, and not extra in a way that's kind of like not important, extra in the way that says the really important thing is the gloss that you bring to it. And somehow if people could internalize that, then they would say, oh my goodness, the way that we've been doing the Seder for the last, my whole life isn't really the quote authentic way. The authentic way would be to do it in this much more creative way. I don't know, something about that. I'm trying to figure out like how we could really get the message through to people that you really don't need to kind of go over every page.
I think it's tough. I mean, first off, I don't blame. You brought up the Maxwell House Haggadah. I think that's like a fascinating thing. I mean, that for those who don't know what that is, it's this coffee company in the early 20th century. They, as a marketing play and as a Jewish ritual intervention, there were people who weren't sure one way or the other if coffee was kosher for Passover, people who thought it was part of the category kitniot, and people who didn't. And so a coffee company led by a Jew literally like made a ritual intervention. They said like coffee's going to be kosher for Passover. Now, did they do that because they thought so through the Jewish law or whatever? Or did they do it because they didn't want people to not buy coffee for a week? Who knows? But they did that. And so, yeah, I think probably. But like they started offering Haggadahs in their own name that were connected to purchases of coffee, which is both cynical and beautiful. Like it's just a really cool American Jewish historical moment. And that Haggadah became preeminent in a lot of places, because it was free. You were free in the sense that you got it when you bought coffee. and B, because it sort of covered the bases in the way that you're talking about. It included all the traditional pieces. It was they still make this. There's been new additions. It contains all of the traditional pieces that, like, from a 21st century traditionalist perspective, check the boxes of a Seder. I don't blame Maxwell House. I think Maxwell House is more reflecting a set of things than it is like creating a bunch of things. But today, you're totally right when you say it's not so much that 90% of Seder goers are thinking, oh, we must do all the pieces. It's that they're aware that one or two people at their Seder want all those pieces, and they want to be a good host. They don't want to make somebody feel like they didn't do the ritual. So they do those pieces. To me, the issue there is not the host hasn't done anything wrong, and the individual people who feel like we need to check a bunch of boxes have also not done something wrong. It's a collective mindset where with all these rituals, not just Passover, we're focused on completing a job. And we're also really focused on the idea that, wow, what I'm doing with my group of people is also being done by millions of other people all around the world. Like, that's why I don't think people just want to do all the stuff for the sake of doing it. They want to do all that stuff because, like, we at our Seder are doing these 14 parts. There are 14 listed parts. That mindset, I don't like. I think that what we should be shooting for, sure, I do want the sense that, wow, my Seder is part of a broader whole. In our spirituality unit, I mentioned how every single spiritual thing I ever do is designed about transcending self, dissolving self, and being part of a broader whole. But the way to do that isn't just by saying the same words that people say all around the world. It's by having a Seder at all. If you have a Seder and somebody else has a Seder and none of your direct words overlap, but you're both doing it for the purposes of observing Passover, that's sharedness. Now, is that a kind of sharedness that is like directly translatable to passing to the next generation so that they can do the same things? No, and that's what people are worried about. They want to have like a core curriculum, basically. The Passover Seder is an educational ritual. You are trying to teach a set of things that children and others learn. That's not my primary goal, honestly. I mean, I want people to learn at Passover, but I'm not like a generalist across the 14 parts and like, oh, you must learn this about the parsley, and you must learn this about the bitter herb, and you must learn this about the breaking the middle matzah, and you must learn this about the 4 questions. What I want to do, I mean, I'm almost imagining like my Seder probably won't do this, but what if I did a Seder that was just one part of the Seder? It was like, we're just this year going to dwell in the Afikomen, in the searching for matzah. We're going to do like 5 different Afikomen scavenger hunts. We're going to have one where we just hide it and look for it in a not particularly creative way. We're going to have others where we do a different kind of Afikomen hunt. We're going to learn the history of the Afikomen. We're going to find out why it's called Afikomen. That's actually really interesting. It's a Greek word that ties to all sorts of things. It's not Hebrew. From every angle, we're going to engage with the Afikomen. And sure, at the beginning, we'll have a Seder plate. Maybe we'll have a couple quick moments where we do some of the other blessings, but we're going to focus on Afikomen this year. And then next year, we're barely going to touch Afikomen, and our Seder is going to be all about some other piece of the Seder. If you did that over the course of 15 years and focused on a different piece of the Seder every time, that would be long-term a more cohesive, deeper experience where everybody in that room would like actually grow in their relationship to Passover and to each part. And so I kind of would want that. And like I have done this to some extent. I choose parts of the Seder every year that I know beforehand we're going to like pause and talk about. This year I chose Elijah, largely because of the Daniel Matt episode that we recently had where we talked about Elijah. I realized that I myself had never thought about who the heck Elijah is when we opened the door for him. So I knew beforehand we were going to talk about that. And so I even moved it towards the beginning of the Seder. That's one angle, is that maybe the problem we have with Seder is that we're trying to do 100 things really shallowly to get through them, as opposed to doing a smaller number of things really deeply.
Well, I like where you're going with the kind of long game of it, the idea of the 15 years time period, saying we're gonna get all the pieces in a deep way over 15 years or 14 years. That's actually really cool, because as you were talking, I was thinking, my experience is just that I always am planning for Passover. I want to, praise myself a little and say the week before, but To be honest, it's the day before when you've really kind of dawns on you that it's really the Seder tonight. And then I tend to go into a tizzy of work and plan some things. And usually the people who are at my Seder are pretty happy with it, I think. But I'm thinking about it this year that what if you really ritualized that for the week after the Seders, that you actually spent time during that week planning next year's Seder in a really deep way, in a way that you could really just take it out of the drawer a year later and it's ready for you. And you've done it in immediate reaction to last year's, to the Seder that just passed. And I think we've talked about this before, that this idea of the Feast of the Matzahs, this 7 days that comes after, 7 days in the Torah, in the diaspora, some people practice 8 days, that comes after the Seder. It's like, what are you supposed to do during those days? And there really isn't a whole lot of ritual. It would be interesting to think about what other things can a person do in terms of the themes of this holiday, things like freedom, poverty, fighting for freedom, fighting against poverty, etc.
One thing that folks might do with the latter days of the holiday is have a Seder. So interesting to me that we have this idea that there are 2 Passover Seders and we put them on back-to-back nights. Like, I understand why historically. It's because there's this notion that certain days are Yom Tov, certain days have certain requirements, and so the Passover Seder is placed on those. What's interesting is literally the last day of the holiday is also Yom Tov, and it would be a lot less exhausting and a lot like everything about that makes little sense to me, that you would have 2 Seders. Why? Why not? We have a long holiday. Put it towards the end if there's going to be 2. First off, I don't think anybody needs to do more than 1, but if you're going to do 2, space it out. The other piece is I really have been thinking lately about the drastic difference your typical person, Jew and otherwise, their knowledge and relationship to Genesis and Exodus versus those 2 books of the Torah versus their knowledge and relationship to Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the final 3 books of the Torah. They know who Adam and Eve are. They know the Noah's Ark shtick. Joseph has a Broadway show. People know a little bit about that. And then the Exodus from Egypt, which is the first half-ish of the book of Exodus, people get to experience during Passover. The rest of the Torah, I think most Jews, most people, they don't have as deep of a relationship to. But I'm kind of curious what it would look like for the latter part of Passover and the weeks of the Omer to be more tied to the wandering in the wilderness. And by the way, that's not new. Like the Omer period, the 7 weeks between sometime during Passover and Shavuot, that is understood as related to this time of wandering. And then the Shavuot moment is when the Torah is received on Mount Sinai. And we've talked about Ushpizin, like welcoming guests to the Sukkah on Sukkot. We've talked about doing that on Hanukkah. I this year have taken on for myself that I'm going to welcome different characters from the latter part of the Torah. And for me, especially the Book of Numbers, I happen to love the Book of Numbers. Characters that don't get as much collective focus. I think we could have a day on Korach and the rebellion that happens in Numbers. We could have a day where we focus on Machla, Noah, Hogla, Milcah, Tirzah, the 5 sisters who inherit land in the Book of Numbers. Like little things that are not part of our consciousness. I'm curious if, like, in the back of a Haggadah that's created, there's new Haggadahs created every year. There could be a little part that's like, here's a shtick for you on day 2, on day 3, on day 4, on day 5, on day 6, on day 7. 1 page for each of those days for you to experience not just the first part of the Exodus from Egypt, but the latter piece of wandering in the wilderness as well.
It connects a little bit with one topic that I wanted to also think about in terms of the Seders. And we've talked about this as well, which is when the Seders take place, and not just the Seders, when all of this stuff takes place. And I think we've talked in the past about the idea that possibly people might have Passover Seders on the weekend because it's more convenient. And actually, a friend of mine recently told me that that's exactly what they're doing, not influenced by listening to Judaism Unbound. They just thought of it on their own. one of the members of the family wanted to go somewhere because it was spring break, I think, that overlapped with Passover. And if they had had the Seder on the regular day that it, says it is on the calendar, then they would have kind of had to not be able to have their spring break all in a row. And so they decided to have it on the previous Friday night or Saturday night or whatever. And I actually think that to some extent that is not unreasonable in the sense that if we look at some of the ancient origins of the holidays, for example, in the book of Exodus, chapter 23, we'll see that the holidays are not really placed on a calendar. They are oriented towards what's going on at that time of year. When we transpose that to our own lives, it's often said, hey, the original calendar or non-calendar of the Israelites was agricultural. Passover is in the month where the unripe wheat comes, and maybe they would just look around and see the unripe wheat, and that was when they would have the Passover holiday. But another way to think about that is that they were attuned to their calendar, to their life's issues, to their life's changes. And for them, they were farmers, so the thing that was changing in their lives was that the grains were coming out or being harvested or whatever. In our life, it might be when spring break happens, right? That is a momentous time on the calendar. It is a time that external factors say we should be doing something at that time. And if you think about the Jewish holidays, they say, yeah, the external calendar is telling us that very, very soon we're going to have to start harvesting. So just before we start harvesting, we should have our Jewish ritual. And I'm trying to transpose that onto our lives today and say, just before this thing happens that is momentous in the outside experience, meaning spring break is coming and we want to have this experience with all the people that we love and care about, it actually makes sense to do it just before that period takes place. And that actually is, in a certain way, traditional and okay. Now, why do I say all of this? Is just because I think that there is a way to think more expansively about what is traditional and what is not traditional. Our temptation is to say, oh, I had a cool idea. I can't really find a way to connect it to the traditional sources or the traditional practices, but I think it would be really cool. Let's try to do it. Versus, I had a cool idea. I actually didn't get it from the traditional sources, but when I think about it, it actually connects in an interesting way to the traditional sources. That, to me, is the tradition. That if we look at the history of the evolution of Judaism, and we're being honest about it, I think what we'll find is that various people at various times had a cool idea that they thought would make the practice of whatever Jewish ritual, in this case a holiday, more meaningful. And they then looked back to try to find a way to connect it to some traditional source and therefore make it acceptable to the people around them. So I'm wondering, for example, you're talking about this idea of the Ushpizin, of the practice from Sukkot, of reflecting on these different characters during this time. And, I feel like taking it one step further would be to say, right, is there some way in the Passover story specifically, right, that we could connect that idea so then people would actually have this more powerful sense that this is actually a Passover tradition that they feel good about continuing in a way. I'm not saying to fool them. I'm saying that to actually start to build that story out.
To me, that's super easy. It's Elijah. You just call it. It's just not usually called Ushpizin. Like we do have an Ushpiz at the Passover Seder, which is welcoming Elijah, and more, many Seders welcome Elijah and Miriam. Miriam, both being prophets tied to the Bible. Yeah, to me, we just call that Ushpizin in a way that we haven't before, and that's the first night's example, and then we build out what our later nights will be. I actually like that we don't have a full list of here are the 7 that you welcome for the days of Passover. I think that it's better that we sort of get the chance to sculpt that on our own level, and it's a structural sharing. It's like I said with the Seder. The thing we share isn't the exact liturgy, the exact people we welcome. It's the fact of welcoming guests. Anyway, I both agree and disagree with you on the timing piece of Passover on the weekend. First off, and the bases on which I disagree with you are not what I think the Torah or the Talmud says. They're solely what I think would be good. So I want to make that explicit. Like, everything you said is a great argument. And my disagreement is not that I think certain other things would be, quote, more authentic. I think that it's good that there is a moment of the year that is really important Jewishly that a lot of people do not take off work or school for beforehand, and it's on a weeknight. The experiential thing of, I went to school on Wednesday. I mean, this year, the first night was on Wednesday. So it's a perfect example. Wednesday is the middle of the week. So sometimes when Passover's first day is on Monday or Friday, it's easier to just sort of latch it onto the weekend and people are able to take off more effectively. This year was Wednesday. And my guess is that a lot of people went to school or went to work on Wednesday. Maybe they were able to cut off early, maybe not, but then there's a Seder. And I actually think that there's a feature, not a bug, to the American calendar isn't sculpted with Jews in mind. And we actually feel that and experience that in this moment. And I also think that it ties to what I said before. Like, if I want a Seder that is more horizontal and where everybody does a little bit ritually and not where it's focused on one or two people, like, the idea that we would move it to the weekend, I think the main reason you'd move it to the weekend is so that the host and the people doing the work, like, are able to breathe and like able to do it on a time where they can prep all the food and do all the prep work. You talked about how it's usually the last day before the Seder where you're really thinking through. That's totally true for me too. I actually think that a Seder on a weeknight where people might not actually be able to do that. Like, even the host may not be able to actually do that. That might be good. That might force a situation where there's more of a horizontality. I don't know if that's a word, where there's more of a spreading out of power and prep and ritual creativity, where, because nobody's able to log 7 hours earlier that day where they're thinking through the precise order or whatever, it opens things up. This has come up before when we've talked about moving holidays. Like, for me, the rhythmic piece of our Jewish calendar where a holiday arises where it arises and we meet it there. I like that. And but all of this is true. And I also think that you're right. And so from my perspective, this goes back to the two Seders thing. Maybe it's not what I said before, and we have one on the first night and one on the last night, although maybe it is. Maybe the two Seders idea should be, and I don't actually care if anybody goes to two, but we should have two moments during Passover that are seen as Seder times. One should be the first night, wherever it is, wherever the 14th, 15th of Nisan is on the calendar. If it's a Tuesday, cool. If it's a Friday, it's cool. If it's a Sunday, cool. The other should be the weekend that's during Passover. Roughly half the Jews out there do a Seder on the first night during the week, if it's during the week, and roughly half of Jews do it on the weekend that's during Passover. And it's just like how, some Jews go to Reform synagogues and some go to conservative synagogues. People have their practice. Maybe some people go to both because they want to do two Seders. That if we sculpted our communities where, like, at every synagogue, at every locality, we're like, okay, we want to make sure there's critical mass of Seders available for the people who really want that first night, whatever day it is. And we're also going to have critical mass of Seders that are available on Shabbat or on the weekend for people that want to go when it's more convenient and doesn't disrupt work and school. And as a community, across institutions, we're going to have enough Seders that are all like available for folks who need a Seder. To me, that would be the dream, because it turns out there's a lot of people looking for Seders. I see it all the time that people they don't find anything. There's a lot of folks out there that want to be at a Passover Seder and do not have one. That's literally against the text of the Haggadah, like the most central text of the Haggadah. And as a community, we're not meeting that. So having two slots that are not back-to-back days, but are spaced a little bit with one in the weekday, one on the weekend, might be a path towards both what you want in terms of having a Seder that's accessible for families, that a weeknight is going to just be stressful and tough and no good, and for people who really are like, I want it to be on whatever Tuesday it is, because that unlocks something in me as a minority, as somebody who has to sort of be made an outsider by a calendar.
Yeah, I mean, I have a gloss on what you're saying, but before I mention that, I mean, just the idea that we go to all this effort to do a Jewish practice, and actually we don't do the one thing that's the most important part, like in this case, making sure that everybody has a place, or caring for those who don't have food, right? It says to everybody who's hungry, come and eat. That we don't do, but we do all these other trappings. I think that's actually pretty common and unfortunate, and that to me is the most important driver for real reworking of Jewish practice, because we've actually drifted too far away from the real purpose. But on the specific thing that you're talking about, the gloss that I have is, what about a world in which the 14th, 15th of Nisan, right, what's generally understood to be the first Seder night in the diaspora, or in Israel, the only Seder night, is the night that is kind of on the calendar, like that is a Seder happens that night. Now, you don't have to do it. I mean, you don't have to do anything, but there's a sense that, like, yeah, this is a day where one Seder happens, and another Seder happens whenever is right for your people. And that might be the weekend. It might be the next day. I mean, there's all kinds of possibilities, and that depends on the needs of the people. And that's where, like, there's a little bit of a difference between, I think, how you were describing it and how I'm thinking about it, which comes down to this question of, like, should there be 2 days that are holy or that are set aside for all Jews? Or is it really about this question of, like, how does it fit into your needs and your calendar? And the way that I'm trying to connect it, and I admit that I'm doing this after the fact, but that I'm trying to connect it to the traditional ideas from the book of Exodus, is that it's not on a Jewish calendar, right? The calendar where the grain is unripe, where the grain comes up but it's not yet ripe, has nothing to do with Judaism. That's what's happening on the calendar around us. And again, sometimes people think, and I honor those who want to think about it as very much tied to the land, and that Judaism is very tied to the land. So I get that for them, they're saying that these are about the cycles of the earth. But I think there's another way to think about it, which is that there are ways in which the outside world imposes itself upon us, and rather than resisting that, we ride it. One of the interesting pieces, though, is, like, there really is, I think, a deep question about the way that Jewish rituals are understood by people and experienced by people, which is the day itself holy, number one? In other words, is there something about this day that if you don't do it on this day, you're not really doing it right for some reason? There's also the idea that it's not a question of whether the day is somehow holy as a day. What makes it holy is that all the Jews are doing something on the same day, and there's something really powerful and holy about that. I'm totally on board that. So that's why I take really seriously your idea that it would be good to have a day where all the Jews are doing something relatively reliably on the same day. Now, some people might do it up big on the Wednesday. Some people might say, I'm going to do my big Seder on Friday night, but I'm still going to do a small mini Seder of some kind on the Wednesday because I want to be part of this day where all the Jews are doing something together. But then there's the third possibility that says it's not about the sacredness of the day, and it's not necessarily about the sacredness of all Jews doing something on the same day. It's about finding a day where the power that this ritual is supposed to have can actually be experienced by me and by those around me. And if that can't happen because I didn't have enough time to prepare, or that can't happen because the people I want to have around me are in Mexico for the week, on spring break, then it's actually more important to have it on the day where the ritual can have the power that it's supposed to have, rather than on a day that is just there because it says it on the calendar. So those are the various options that, I kind of want to have floating around as possibilities.
Yeah, I like that taxonomy of the potential ways we understand the sacredness of the day. And just to re-articulate it as I understood it, because I think it's really worth being a takeaway of this episode. One is that the day, 14th, 15th of Nisan for Passover or whatever, like the day that a holiday happens, holy day, sacred day, it holds sacredness. Whatever day of the week it is, that's number one. Number two is it's not so much about the day. A day is just a day. What makes it holy is that a set of people spread all around the world are all doing a set of things together, or not together, but they're doing a set of shared things on that day. So still, it happens to be the case that that day is sacred, but it's actually not the day. It's not the time on the calendar. It's the actions that people do that mobilize sacredness on a day. And then the third is it's neither of those. It's not the time on the calendar, and it's not the sharedness. The third option is the sacredness is in collectively noticing when a ritual, when it's able to touch its participants the most. And for a lot of people, that is likely to be a weekend, or it's likely to be, like you said, sort of adjacent to spring break as opposed to on spring break, or whatever, or maybe on spring break as opposed to before it, whatever it is for a specific community. I don't have an answer to that, but I love that threefold set of questions. I think it's extremely deep. I think even the Talmud asks some of the questions about that. Like with Havdalah, with the ritual separating Shabbat from the rest of the week, there seem to be back and forths around whether Shabbat just ends at a time when there's 3 stars in the sky, when the sun goes down, etc., versus Havdalah ending when humans do a set of things. When we say some blessings, when we do some rituals, that's the same question. Like, is it that the calendar exists independent of humans doing anything, and time changes and has sacred flow independent of you and me and the rest of humanity? Or is it that time on the calendar is not inherently anything, and it's humans marking it as such that gives it sacredness? And it might not be a either or. There might be ways that it's both. Anyway, the other thing that I wanted to respond to is I'm realizing that when I worked for a Jewish organization before this job, we had a calendar of days that were on our work calendar as like everybody gets off from work. And this was a Jewish organization, so a lot of Jewish holidays. That's obviously not the case for companies that are like not Jewish in nature most of the time. But one of the days we could take off was the day of the first Seder night. If the Seder night is a Wednesday, everybody at this organization had the option to not go to work Wednesday during the day, even though that's technically on the Jewish calendar a different day. And that, I think, is a version of what you're describing, because that is this organization saying, okay, we're going to go option 3. It's funny. I'm saying option 3, not B'nai Lappy's option 3. The third framework that you brought, we're noticing that for our employees, it's actually a bigger day. The day before the first Seder night is a bigger day because you have to do all the prep. You have to, whether it's coming up with your ideas for ritual, whether it's making food, whether it's prepping your house, all of the things that happen that day. That day is more important to have off from work than the next day. Now, I do think that next day was also on the calendar as one you could take off. But that's noticing the reality of your participants and when something is going to be most powerful for them. There's ways we could do that more, whether that's incorporating weekends, spring breaks. Like I like the angle you're bringing, even as I myself, I lean towards those first 2 options. I am like mystic enough that I think time itself holds some sacredness, or at least we can choose for it to hold some sacredness, and that's like a nice choice to make. And the last piece I'd say is if people do want ancient precedent for any of this, Karaites think that the Torah was written in a way where Shavuot, 7 weeks after Passover, is always on a weekend. That's their interpretation of the text of the Torah, that you start counting the Omer the day after Shabbat, which of course Shabbat being a Saturday, and then you start on the Sunday, and then Shavuot is always on a Sunday, no matter what. Obviously, they didn't have the weekend in the same sense, but we could use it in our time as saying, well, there's actually this ancient way in which a certain holiday tied to Passover, because Shavuot and Passover are intrinsically tied, is always on a weekend. So Passover might also have, like whatever the weekend is during Passover, I actually do agree with you 100% with no complications that the weekend of Passover, whether it's the Seder, whether it's not, whatever, it should hold a special place. There should be certain things that we do on the weekend of Passover. Anyway, that's like a set of rants, but we do have that biblical tie-in to a holiday that's always on a weekend.
Yeah, and just to note that I'm becoming a little more mystically inclined given our last bunch of episodes. But there is maybe an argument that says that we should do both. We should open up both as legitimate. And I think we both agree that the second official diaspora night of holidays should go by the wayside. Like with that, we don't need to worry about that anymore. We know when the holiday is, unlike in the past, so we actually don't need that second night anymore. But the idea that actually that second night is an interesting precedent for saying that now maybe there's a different reason that we don't know the best way to do something. And it's not because we don't know what day it is, it's because we don't know what would be the most powerful. And so we want to give both options, and we want to make both options sacred. And I like that a lot. And I think that's a good segue towards the end of our show today, just to say a few words about this certificate program that we're opening up in the Onion Yeshiva, because what we're trying to do here is invite all of you to really step forward and feel more and more confident and authorized to get involved with all of this thinking, and to not necessarily feel like you have to tune in to us to talk about it, or like you were saying, Lex, that you're kind of seen by the people at your Seder as like the rabbi who knows more. And now we're trying to figure out how to take it even further and say, now it's not just that we're offering a variety of classes, but we're actually offering people an experience that gives them a chance to immerse themselves in knowledge and also in this unbound perspective, and goes back to those early episodes where we had the chutzpah versus knowledge curve. We're trying to create a way of learning about Judaism that keeps your chutzpah high as your knowledge grows, and that we actually are working on a way of doing that that allows you basically to take a bunch of classes in the Onion Yeshiva and then a special capstone experience. And we feel confident that you will then feel confident, and we will then give you a certificate that endorses your self-confidence to say, you don't have to listen to this podcast anymore. I mean, we hope that you will, but you'll be able to do that on your own. You want to say some more about that program?
I do. I have two things. One is on what you said about the second night and how both you and I think that this diaspora requirement idea is not super fit for our times. Firmly agree. The other set of takeaways is totally the certificate program. But on that second night piece, I do think that in most situations, it would make most sense to, if there's going to be two ritualized collective gatherings, have it on the first night and then have it a few nights later or at the end of the holiday, to space it out so that there's not this overwhelm. That said, if you're out there and your family's tradition or what you've learned on it is to have two seders, first night and second night. When people watch reality shows, often there's a 2-night finale. They spread it out over 2 nights. I think if from the get-go you had a group of people who were going to share 2 seders together, and you said, you know what, it's too much liturgy, you come up with some progression where half of the ritual that you want to achieve in the Seder is on one Seder, and the other half is at the second Seder. And both would be shorter. And you would avoid the situation of like grumbling because we're not getting to food. You could move the food earlier on night one because all of the ritual elements you could put before and after it, and it's only half the material. So I think that that's one angle if you're going to have 2 Seders. I still ultimately think that it makes more ritual sense to space that out, but that's a possibility. Now, the certificate program. Absolutely. I am really, really jazzed about it. And I mean, if I understood you properly, you were sort of communicating that our classes, some of our mini courses, otherwise, they can be experienced as like ritual for that time of year in a certain sense. Like doing a 3-week deep dive during the Omer between Passover and Shavuot. It's not just that you're learning about material. It's that you're doing something deeply Jewish during a period of the calendar year that is coded for building meaning Jewishly. And I don't care if it's not that witchcraft or interfaith families or the various things that are the core subjects of our mini courses, it's not that that's what the Omer is quote unquote about traditionally. So I hope and invite that people will take those courses as a way not just of learning about Judaism, but of doing Judaism. Maybe before each class or at the end of each class, you do the little count of the Omer of the days between Passover and Shavuot, as a way of marking that you're doing that connected to your learning. So that's some thoughts on the mini courses. With the certificate program, I couldn't be more jazzed about what this is going to be. For those who are curious, we've already had I think like 75 or close to 100 people submit their like basic information form to learn more. That's not all of those people have applied in terms of submitting all the materials, but it's still really exciting to see that people really want to immerse in long form learning through our Judaism Unbound lens. I really encourage folks to fill out that basic information form. That's super quick. It's at judaismunbound.com/certificate. And then once you fill it out, you'll get an email that gives you instructions for how you can do the rest of the application. I think this cohort is going to be an incredible next stage for our organization. I think it's going to empower a set of people it's funny, I started this conversation by saying we need more horizontal structures. Judaism Unbound has not been all that horizontal. It's been you and I holding most of the ritual leadership, most of the public speaking leadership, etc. I think the certificate program is going to empower people to do that, not just in their own local communities, but also in our spaces. I'm excited for these people to experience some deep learning. And then when our holiday gatherings online come around, for them to really step up and be leaders of them and start to be voices of Judaism Unbound, not just people who listen to Judaism Unbound from you and me. So I'll close with that. And the last thing that I'll say is we always deeply appreciate any correspondence, notes from you, questions, ideas, thoughts, hot takes. Send them our way. I'm going to start with our email addresses. I usually don't, but email addresses for Dan and I are dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. Send ideas related to Passover our way. Send questions about the certificate program. Whatever is living within you, send those our way. You can also be in touch via social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Our handles are @JudaismUnbound. You can visit our website, judaismunbound.com, to check out our show notes for this episode, learn more about the Young Yeshiva, all that good stuff. And last but not least, we are deeply appreciative of those who are able to support us financially, which you can do on either a monthly recurring basis or just as a one-time gift via judaismunbound.com/donate. So thanks to all of you for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.